Welcome to Signals and Stories.
I'm Kelly Miller,
And I'm Robin LeGassicke.
and this is the podcast where we unpack the signals shaping our industry and the stories that are shaping us. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into a topic, talk about it a little bit in Landscape Pulse, and interview a guest who's a specialist in the area. And from there, we'll wrap things up with hot takes and headaches.
Yeah, and today's topic is data, and specifically how brands, publishers, and marketers can better leverage consumer intelligence to make smarter decisions and drive real business outcomes.
And while there's no shortage of data available, the challenge isn't accessing it. It's really about knowing what to do with it, what matters, and connecting data sets in the right way and turning it into action.
Yeah, and to help us unpack that, we're going to be joined by David Phillips. He's the Chief Media and Activation Officer at Environics Analytics. And David has spent the last couple of decades helping organizations navigate audience measurement, consumer data, analytics, and activation. From media measurement to data strategy, he's had a front row seat on how data has transformed marketing. But before we speak to him, we'll spend some time discussing the landscape. Landscape Pulses, where Kelly and I will share some knowledge and thoughts on today's topic. So, 30 years ago, marketers struggled to get enough information. And today we have that opposite problem. Consumer data, behavioral data, transactional data, media data, location data, so much data. The challenge isn't collecting it, it's really figuring out what actually matters.
Absolutely. And many organizations are still operating in silos with the publisher metrics as well as brand metrics. And then you add in their retailer as well as first party data that's incoming. There's a lot of mixed components there. And the real value is when these data sets really start coming and working together.
hmm the marketers that are winning today aren't really the ones with the most data. They're the ones that can connect data sources and turn them into actionable decisions. It can be so confusing for marketers to even know where to start. How do they build a data strategy that allows them to leverage all of that rich data that they have? Or is it even sufficient, the amount that they have? And then the technology that's required and the compliance issues on top of that makes it difficult. And marketers are having to shift further and further from the core of their role, really, when it comes to the subject.
Exactly. And marketers aren't trained in all of these nuances. And it's so important. And we see this every day working with our clients. And it really creates this interesting dynamic internally with organizations because there is a matrix. Marketers are holding on to some of these data sets, as well as the digital teams, insight teams, or the data teams. And having all these stakeholders together, understanding where they can connect and where they can leverage each other's data, bring it together, and then utilize it. It can seem overwhelming. And when you bring all those components together, that's where we often see things get stalled because nobody sort of knows what the next steps are or what to do with all of those incoming pieces of the puzzle. But when they can come together and there can be actionable outcomes that are looking at those business results in a really great way together, it's where we see great results happening. And that's why we're really excited to talk to David today because he's been in this field for a long time. He's an expert, and I think he can really help us unravel this ball of yarn.
Agreed. David,
Hi.
thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
You've spent your career helping organizations understand audiences, from media measurement and audience analytics to helping brands activate consumer data today. For those that don't know your story, can you give us a brief overview of how you got to where you are
Sure.
today?
Yeah. It not a normal path, really, if there is such a thing. So I did a French degree, a master's in modern European culture, which has nothing to do with anything apart from this concept of Europe. And then I had no idea what to do as a job, so I went to London, started in media sales, which was odd, and then sort of got into the sort of research side of things from there. Worked for a company called TGI, which is sort of like Vivid Data but international, and then had a sort of quarter life crisis, moved to Canada, ended up working for what was then BBM Canada. And then when they started the company that became Enlogic, they asked me to move from Vancouver to Toronto. So I ran Enlogic for 16 years, which was a company that dealt with sort of broadcast data and software and good stuff like that. And then 3 years ago, I moved to EA. So a very weird journey around data because I never really spent a lot of time in numbers,
Mm.
but I spent most of my career around data.
Interesting. And what do you do in your current role at Environics?
Oh, well, that's not a question I was asked to
Okay.
prepare for, so let's just think about that. So my title is Chief Media and Activation Officer, and there's kind of 3 areas I deal with. So one is looking after the team that helps our clients in that industry. So agencies, platforms, and publishers use the data that we have at EA, the services we have. The other is working with particularly what we call data collaboration services. So that's clean rooms and identity resolution and that kind of stuff, helping clients, particularly in those industries I mentioned before, understand how to use those. And then latterly, or not latterly, sort of thirdly, it's helping all our other clients understand how to activate in media. So EA, the company I work for, most of our clients are actually advertisers. So about 5-10% of our revenue is media. The rest of it is with advertisers. So how do we help all those guys understand how they can take the insights that we generate for them and activate them in media?
It's great. Super interesting. You've had a front row seat at the evolution of audience measurement
Yes.
because that is a big topic. And when you look back over the last 20 years, what would you say the biggest shift on how marketers think about data is?
Yeah, it's a fascinating time. And you're right, it's weird that I've been around audience measurement for a long time, both in the UK and Canada. I think that there's a few things. One is it's a sort of era of data it can't happen. So data it didn't happen, rather. There's a dependency and a kind of centrality of data that hasn't, for marketers, maybe hasn't always been the case. We've also got more data around than we've ever had. So if I think back to sort of 20 years ago, just the sheer number of data sets that are available today are sort of on the sheer number of types of behavior. That's sort of exploded, really. So you can do things now that you couldn't do before. So you can measure things, you can understand things, you can put data together in different ways. I think what I would say is I don't think we've seen a growth in understanding how to use data. And I think, if anything, I think we've seen a diminution in understanding of how to understand data. So we've tended to, and this will be a theme I may go back to, but we've tended to see more data as equating necessarily to more understanding and more insights. I think actually what we've done is we've lost a lot of the sort of critical thinking around how to use data. Back in my day, which is, extraordinary thing for me to say, there were people whose jobs it was to really sort of be practitioners of data, to really understand how data was put together, how it was made. And I think we've got a lot more users of data, but probably fewer people who understand sort of the fundamentals of it and how it's put together and therefore what you can do with it. So we've got this weird sort of best of times, worst of times, where we have more opportunity than ever before to do things, but we've not necessarily invested in the skills and the rigor to take as much advantage of it and to sort of be as smart with it as we could be, I think.
So we have talked about this a lot with other guests around this notion of being data rich but insight poor.
Yeah.
And, many organizations are like that. It's kind of a two-parter, is why you think that gap still exists.
Yeah.
Is it, a little bit of what you just talked about? And then what separates the organizations that can actually turn that data into outcomes and from those that don't?
Yeah. I think I think about this a lot. And I think one is just in business in general, maybe in life in general, we don't often stop to think about almost like our understanding of the fundamentals. So for instance, if you were to ask marketers or anyone working with data, how would you define an insight versus data? I'm not sure how many people could come up with a quick, coherent response. And so part of it is like, well, are you sure do you know what you're looking for? So when you're saying I want to derive insights from this, well, what is that for you? And I remember spending not years solely thinking about this because I wasn't in a cave, but I did spend a lot of time thinking about this. And so I came up with a working definition for me, which is an insight is a data point that leads to some kind of decision. So otherwise, it's just a data point. But if you don't have some kind of framework within your head and within your organization about, well, as a company, how do we define the insight? And therefore, what is it that we're looking to do? Or how are we trying to treat our data so we can get there? Then you won't get there. And again, you'll end up equating data with an insight, which is they're not the same thing. One's an output of the other. So part of it is, have companies put in the effort to sort of say, well, here's what we define an insight is. I think the other bit is because we've had this proliferation of data, again, we haven't really stopped to think about where in our organization and where in our decision making should those data fit. So I used to go, I don't do this anymore because it's considered impolite, but like I used to say there should be no such thing as a data strategy because it's a bit like saying I've got a tool strategy. You're like, well, what kind of house are you trying to build? And what state is the house in right now? So I think, every organization needs to start by not by saying, what data do I have, but what decision-making framework or what objectives do I have? And then you line up the data that you've got underneath those decisions. So if you say, okay, I've got, 6 areas I need to figure out in my company, you go, okay, what kind of data can help me derive what I believe an insight to be in each of those areas? And then do I have it or not? And because again, otherwise what you get is you'll get like 15 sources of data under one area and nothing under the rest. Well, that's not actually going to help you. What you need to do is kind of think about how you can expand the breadth of your data to reach all the objectives that you've got, not the way around. So the good organizations will go through that work of saying, what is it we're trying to do? What data can help me with that decision? Frankly, is there an area I can't really be helped with data, which I know seems like heretical to say for somebody who works at a data company, but not every decision is fully informed by data. You have to make a punt sometimes or an educated guess. So going through that rigor will separate the good ones from the ones who just have lots of data.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about that in terms of, the data strategy, I think that's what, when we talk to our clients about a data strategy, it's how to set that framework up.
Yeah.
Or here's the hypotheses, here's what we're trying to answer for. What data then do I have that can support that?
Right.
And how do I find or build data sources for what I don't have?
Yeah, and all the classic, we tend to count what can be counted. And you're like, well, that's great, but if that's not really important to you, then it doesn't really matter. And actually what it will do, we think a lot about this concept called a broken compass, where it's much worse to have a compass that looks like it's right than not having a compass at all. If you don't have a compass at all, you'll be like, well, I'll just have to rely on my wit. So I'll have to like not be too confident in decision making. If you've got a compass that's a couple of degrees off and you're confident that it's right, you'll end up miles away from where you want to be. So I think a lot of us operate with broken compasses. And funny enough, this came from personal experience when I was running the company I ran, Environics. We'd do an employee survey, every 6 months or 3 months or something. And the results were consistently really good. And at the same time, I'd have people come to me saying, people are really unhappy. And they're really kind of like, grumpy and they're demotivated. And this was a kind of signals versus noise thing because, when you're leading an organization or if you're in a senior position, you get a bunch of stuff coming at you all the time. And so you have to learn to like, well, what do I react to and what do I don't? What's signal here and what's noise? So it was easy for me to say, well, that's just a few grumblings, which always happens. And this data is showing me that actually everyone's, if anything, happier than before. So I followed the data, but I was wrong because actually people were really unhappy. It just wasn't showing up in the survey. So it was a really sort of painful lesson to learn that you need to put data in its proper context, and data can't always help you understand everything completely.
For sure. I think marketers spend a lot of time, and a big part of their job is understanding their consumer, their specific consumer. And, to your point about the compass, that's really interesting when you think about that, because a consumer or an audience can either seem really narrow or really broad to a lot of marketers. What's the biggest misconception that marketers have when it comes to consumer data today? And how do you see it being used really effectively in some cases by marketers to understand their consumers better?
Yeah, I think another way of thinking about, this area is that sometimes we make two equal and opposite mistakes with data. One is asking too much of it and the other is not asking enough of it. So sometimes I think marketers will look at consumer data they have and ask too much of it. They'll go, this helps me understand everything I need to know about them. And, or as long as I get a bit more data, I can understand them fully. And it's that weird thing where we go to work and forget that we're people and forget about people. That we don't make logical decisions all the time. We assume our consumers were because we've got data on them. So, I think fundamentally humans aren't that predictable or understandable, and we like to think we are, because in business we like to have a sense of control. So part of it is, okay, again, put the data you do have in the context where it can help you. Don't ask it to do things that it can't do. The other bit is sometimes we don't ask enough of it. So we don't ask, where does it come from? Is it actually sufficiently rigorous? Is it from a particular platform or a particular place that has its own sample, that has its own bias? And that's not necessarily a bias in a bad way, but the data comes from something, so therefore it's going to reflect something, and it's going to be good at things and not so good at other things. So, it sort of do a meta-analysis of your data. Am I asking too much of it, or do I need to ask a few more questions of it so I can understand where to put it in my context of decision making? That being said, again, to go back right to the start, marketers now do have the opportunity to have so much more understanding of their consumers. And, we do see a lot more marketers having better insights and having better understanding of their consumers. There just tends to be a bias towards thinking the data they've got represents a complete understanding of the consumers, which is often not always the case.
Right. Do you think that sometimes that narrows marketers down, too narrowly into thinking what their audience is, because they're focused on some of these unique points within the data set, instead of sort of analyzing that and finding maybe some key behaviors or key understandings that can broaden their audience?
Yeah, I mean, this may be a slightly weird way to go from that observation, but I think the other thing I've been fascinated in is the sort of the role that data plays in decision making within companies, and the role that numbers play in our decision making. I used to do this presentation where I'd ask people honestly, without thinking about it too much, if they thought 50% was more accurate than a half. And I think instinctively we would probably all say, yeah, 50% is more accurate.
Right.
Because we have this weird relationship, this interesting relationship with numbers, where if it's a number, we think it's super precise and super accurate. So I think all of us, including marketers, have tended to kind of gravitate towards understanding consumer in a way that the data I've got will let me understand, which is different than understanding my consumer. And there's another person who should have on this podcast who's called Kristen Wozniak, who's fantastic. Because I was saying to her, like, I just find this role of data within companies fascinating. Why is that? And she came up with what I think is the best explanation, which is data essentially lets you abdicate a certain amount of responsibility for decision making. So if you go, well, we're going to do this because I reckon it's the right thing to do, and it's not, like, that's on you. If you go, well, the data says we should do this, and you do it, it doesn't turn out, you're like, well, the data, what am I going to do with the data? So again, it goes back to that, I can't remember the question now, but it goes back to that relationship that we need to have, which is this kind of, trust but verify. Like, what is the data able to tell me? Am I asking too much of it? And I think if I'm remembering what you said now, I think that because so much of the data we've had added to our palettes and our portfolios recently has given the appearance of being very precise, which is different than being precise. We've ended up narrowing our focus, and again, we've sort of forgotten the context of what consumers actually are like. And this is a sort of plug, if you like, for EA data. One of the reasons I like the EA data and why it's used so much, I think, is because it tends to talk about people as people. So, our data is typically neighborhood based, so postal code based. So it's not trying to describe an individual. It's trying to describe people like that, which is sort of how decisions get made by us as consumers. It's not necessarily an individual consumption behavior, I don't think. It's a kind of people like that, especially if you're trying to market to people. People like that actually makes a lot more sense, because we're not down these really narrow tracks as people. We will tend to go either side of our kind of recorded behavior to stuff that's typical, for people like us. So describing people like us, I think, tends to be a more accurate way, even if it looks less precise. And again, people are maybe fudging those two things a little bit. If I've got a really, really precise description, it's more accurate. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Because people are so multifaceted and no two people are alike. But are you saying it's like about finding those intersects of commonalities between sort of different groups and consumers?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only are no two people alike, but no same person is alike the same multiple times during the day.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
go,
Yeah. True.
we've all been hungry. We all know that if we go shopping when we're hungry, we buy more stuff than we don't. So we'll buy more things if we go there at 20 to 6 than if we do at 1 o'clock. So again, to think that I will always buy and purchase in a predictable way doesn't meet your own lived experience.
Yeah.
So why do we think that if we've got data on that with consumers, then they'll act in this kind of rational, predictable way? Because we know we don't, and we're not exceptions. We're the same as everyone else. But again, I think it goes back to that comforting, reassuring role that data can play. So people will tend to lean on that kind of data that looks precise because that looks like you're doing a good job.
Right. Yeah.
It's difficult to go to your boss and go, well, I reckon this is right. Because they're like, what do you mean you reckon it's right? You're like, well, and you don't want to wax lyrical about the unpredictability of human behavior because they'll be like, yeah, can you just do your job, please? So we've tended to gravitate towards the data that makes us look like we're really precise because it makes us look better, but that's not actually us doing a better job.
Yeah, it's true. But it's interesting when we talk about humans and human behavior and everybody, wanting to think that they are an individual, because you are, and that leads to different consumer behaviors. And as we get this evolution of data points, consumers are looking for more relevant, personalized experiences. Yet, they also want privacy and control of their data. And so there's this sort of like juxtaposition and this tension that exists there. How do you see brands able to balance the two?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpick there. I think one is, I can have the weirdest hobby horses, the weirdest things I go on about, but like I get grumpy about weird things, but and enthusiastic about weird things. But there's a difference between relevant and personalized, and so there was a lot of talk a few years ago about like everyone's personalization. I'm like, I don't buy that at all. If you think about the best ads that everyone loves, they are the least targeted ads, the Super Bowl ads. So if you take the kind of the archetype of like an ad that literally will be shared around, that is much more interesting than a game where it's caught with hands and they call it football, but that's another hobby horse of mine. But those ads are not targeted at all. They're meant for a mass audience, but they're relevant because they're brilliant because they've invested in creativity. So I think let's not confuse relevant and personalized. I think when it comes to the push and pull around data, I think one of the key things that marketers and brands need to understand or need to be conscious of is don't follow the abiding sin of the digital industry, which is essentially a bait and switch. So I think when the value exchange isn't clear, people get grumpy, people get understandably upset. And I think what's happened with the foundations of the internet is that Google was like, hey, here's a bunch of free stuff. We're like, that's great. Isn't it great that a company can run on free? And we didn't stop to think, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's on us partly. But it also wasn't clear what we were giving up in exchange for what we got back. And so I think if you run that out, that's led to a lot of this skepticism of data being collected because it wasn't clear what the value exchange wasn't clear. And I think if you look now, we work with a lot of legal teams on to their consent language. We're looking at their consent language. One of my colleagues Jan Kessel's our founder, has been a leader around privacy for 40 years probably. And our chief privacy officer, Scott Amanda Maltby, used to be the chief privacy officer of Canada Post. So we've got some deep experience in our company looking at this. And we're beginning to see examples where the language is just so much better. And the one I thought about recently, there were two I thought about recently. One is I was on Air Canada, and basically if you put your Aeroplan number in, I think it is, or you put your email in, you get like free internet access. So the value exchange is pretty clear. That like, all right, I guess I'm giving you my email, but I get $8 worth of internet for 4 hours. But the language around it was just super clear. It was like, we're going to use your email, and in exchange, you get free Wi-Fi. I'm like, fine,
Great,
go for it.
I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm giving you.
Yeah, and it was a very legitimate value exchange, and I think that was a good deal for me and a good deal for them. So I think be clear about the value exchange, because I think the other thing is, one of the great things about working at EA is because we work with such a wide range of clients, so we get to see how our data used well helps, police services properly allocate shifts. We get to see how municipalities get to make sure the services that their citizens will need to be there in 3 years are going to be, the ground's going to get broken now. And we get to see how, marketers make sure that the right stuff's on the right shelves to the right people. So, the core of EA is an abiding belief that good data used well is good for everyone. So, but part of that is making sure that you're clear on how that data is collected, that you're open with your consumers about what you can do with it, and that value exchange is made real. Because when you do, it is better for everyone. And you get, again, we tend to think just advertising, but when you get to see, again, the allocation of services for people new to Canada being driven by our data in a municipality that they're moving to, it's a good reminder that data is, it should be, for the common good if it's done well.
Right. And really, it's interesting, right? You're talking about too, because we do give out our data across so many different things every single day, right? It just seems that we don't think about it often. When we do it, we sign up, we put our email in, and there it is. But with that, there's a mix of data points. So publishers have their own data sets. Retailers, that's a big one that's growing fast, as well as platforms and digital onsets. There's a big opportunity in the marketing world where all of these things can come together for a data integration. And like we were talking about, being able to use that better. Where do you see the biggest opportunity in this, in bringing all of these, for marketers, all of these data sets from different sources together?
Yeah, I mean, it's an area that we've been focused on at EA for like 6 years or so. What we call, again, data collaboration services. And it sort of actually links to all the things we were talking about, where, if you're someone, you're collecting first party data on your consumer, when you realize the sort of the strengths and weaknesses of that data, when you say, if you ask enough of it, you say, okay, what is this data and what can I do with it? What can't I? You realize a couple of things very quickly, which is it's fantastically deep data on a fairly narrow part of a consumer's life.
Right.
So it's a really good explanation of how they interact with you in that context. But then you quickly see, well, what it's lacking is context. What are they like outside of that interaction with me? Sorry, I get very excited moving the micro. So this is how they buy from me, but like even basic stuff like, well, they may be a heavy shopper with me, but are they a light shopper with me compared to how they shop with my competitor? I don't know. I just know that within my context, they're a heavy shopper, but I could be missing a trick if that's the only way I understand them. So I think increasingly companies are saying, well, how can I broaden that understanding of my consumer out? So I add to that depth of understanding they have with me, which is critical often, with a broader context. Because without that context, you don't know relativity, but also you don't really know how else to talk to them. So, okay, again, it's like getting to know someone and you only know them in one context. It's like, well, I don't really know that person that well. And so I think that there's two, broad categories that you can do that. One that we've done for 20 companies have done and we have specialized in for like 23 years is adding third-party data to that. So, if you think I've got a loyalty card, I might not know the demographics. Okay, you can add demographics from my data, or I might not know how they feel about what they do outside of this interaction with me in terms of what sports they play or what, how much money they have or that kind of stuff. So adding third-party data like EAs can really, if you think about that now, it begins to like expand it out. And then you can sort of say, well, if I could combine my narrow and deep understanding with a narrow and deep understanding that someone else has that I don't have, how could I do that? So if I have this understanding of them with a retailer, but I want to understand how they work with this airline, how they do that. And that's where data collaboration services goes. And so all this stuff around clean rooms and matching stuff, it's really just bringing those data sets together in a way that respects the privacy of the consumers.
Okay.
So that's what we call data collaboration, is essentially bringing those two data sets together. Could be two, could be more. And there you get to see combinations, and you get to see like an area of those consumers that you wouldn't otherwise see that's unique and that can be really valuable.
So when all of those things are brought together, and it's put together in sort of this unique way and collaborated on, what's the best way in terms of outputs, or how is it utilized in the best way?
Yeah, a bunch of different things. And again, echo back right to the start, like the good companies use this well will say, okay, what am I trying to figure out first? So
Mhm.
we tend to go, what can I do? It's like, well, that's great, but like, what am I trying to figure out? So it could be, for example, when we first started doing this before I was at the company, it was less around media usage and more around things like M&A or partnerships.
Mhm.
So, you're someone like a Canadian Tire and you're like, okay, well, do I do a deal with Petro-Canada? Do a deal with Walmart? Do I do a deal with something like that? And so getting that rich understanding of each other's customers is a classic way that people would use data collaboration. So really it just stays there. It says, okay, what's the overlap between these people? Maybe again, you enrich it with data like EAs, but you're just trying to find out the commonalities and the differences between your two kind of deep understandings of the consumer in different contexts. Latterly, what we've seen more of is, okay, if I've figured out what this group is that I think is really attractive because, we think they will respond well to this particular offer, then you can activate what we call activate, which is, Jan always reminds me that it's not just activation in media, it can be activation in terms of, I'll put different things on the shelves or I'll make different offers to people, but it can be, often it is, I'll use those audiences as a target audience in media. So, we're seeing a lot of that as well. And the bit that I get disproportionately excited about is outcomes measurement. So in other words, once I can put together exposure to an ad with sales data, then I can figure out, okay, did the ad work in terms of driving a particular behavior? So that's something that if I would be drunk within about 2 hours of Monday morning if I drank every time I said the word outcomes, but it's just something we're doing a lot right now. But for a wizened, old, extremely old measurement person to be able to say, we did this work for Think TV where we showed the effectiveness of TV at the campaign level at driving CPG sales. I got, it like warmed my wizened, cynical old heart to be able to do that because I've been trying to do that for 25 years. So that was the other bit I get very excited about.
Yeah, I think we talk about outcomes a lot, so I hear you on the let's not play a drinking game with that one.
You can don't get me
'Cause
started,
you
Robin.
can,
I'll
yeah.
go on.
Uh,
It'll be a whole other podcast episode. Just me.
But we
figuring
also,
outcomes.
I would say, when we talk about outcomes, we're talking about how to leverage data to the best of its ability to drive those outcomes, and connecting publisher intelligence with brand intelligence is the sort of the hot topic these days, and what I would say a lot of companies and marketers are sort of placing bets on, and we want to see it done in a responsible and effective way. And I would love to hear a little bit from you in terms of what becomes more possible that
Yes.
hasn't been possible before. How should marketers be looking at what the possibilities are when they start to do that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think it's not that the others weren't excellent. It's like when you're at a restaurant, they go, "Good choice." It's like, oh, but what? The cod was bad. So in my mind, every marketer should have some kind of measurement framework, and you're probably working with your clients if they don't have them to help them establish one of those things. So you've got sort of something equivalent to like an MMM or econometric model at the top, which is sort of overall, when I'm including external factors and whatever, how are things working out, and what channels are driving particular outcomes. And outcomes here, I'm talking primarily sort of sales or to direct stuff. Obviously, outcomes, that's another topic, but like outcomes is very much an umbrella term, and so marketers need to be really clear on what they mean by outcomes when they're saying outcomes. In this context, we're talking, I think, really about sort of sales, for example. Underneath that, you've got the sort of channel specific stuff, and this is where your point, Kelly, earlier, we've got a bit out of whack because we've had channel specific stuff for particular channels, and not for others. So we've had Facebook, Google, everyone else giving you a bunch of information about how their channels are performing, and then TV, out of home, print, radio, blank squares. So as a result, because we've not put data in its proper context all the time, and because we've thought that more data is more effective or more insights, there's been a massive shift of overinvestment in the channels that are lit up those boxes to the detriment of brands. So there's a lot of work saying that the strength of brands has declined significantly across the last 10, 15 years. And there's I think a correlation between that and an overinvestment in stuff that shows it's working.
Right.
Because the other stuff is working, it's just not been showing it. So some of the opportunities we've got right now are to begin to light up some of those other channels. So again, the work we did with Think TV, the work we're doing with Bar Media is lighting up those channels for TV, for linear TV and for connected TV, just to show a marketer a bit more information about a bit more of their portfolio at that level. It's not trying to explain everything. It shouldn't be seen to be doing it any more that the Google bit should be seen to be trying to explain everything, but it's helping you understand that bit a bit more. So I think that's really exciting. And I think that, frankly, as all media becomes distributed digitally, then that just means that that should balance this out a little bit. I think the one, as in, if I was able to measure everything equally, I probably wouldn't have an over-investment in performance, probably, hopefully. I think the other thing, though, that is worth stating here is that, and again, it goes back to our weird relationship with data, especially in decision-making and supporting decisions, is that it's really hard to measure some of the most important things. So, impact on brand, creative effectiveness, all that. It's easy to do, but it's not easy to do in a way that looks as cool and compelling as performance. So we've tended to not focus on that. So I would hope that what we're able to do is, linking back to my point about our outcomes being an umbrella term, that people say, okay, outcomes is a spectrum. So at the top, I've got brand. And at the bottom, I've got performance. Let's make sure I'm measuring all of that. And I think, EA's got different ways we can help measure different ways of that funnel, but we need to make sure that people are holding those in the right balance.
Right. And we are really kind of obsessed with measuring those immediate outcomes, right? The clicks, conversions, ROAS. Do you think we're measuring the right things? Or on the flip side, are we optimizing towards the wrong outcomes potentially?
Usually the latter. We're usually optimizing towards our outcomes. And I think it's, again, I'm a firm believer that possibly the most undervalued value in business is humility. That we don't often think, well, maybe I don't know, or maybe what I'm looking at isn't right. And I think, maybe I'm not all that smart after all. And so I think because it's hard for us to say, maybe we've been slightly, not tricked, but like there's a gamification element to performance metrics that we don't like to admit. Right. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. It's immediate. It's easy to see.
It's a dopamine hit. Right. It's like getting a notification. And so I think we wouldn't like to admit, especially in a business context, because we like to think we're smart in business and we make rational decisions, which is nonsense. We're the same people, we just in a different place. But we don't like to think that, well, I'm making a decision because it's got a really nice dashboard and it gives me a dopamine hit. But that's probably why it's happening. And so without that humility to say, maybe I'm being trick's the wrong word, but like maybe I'm responding to this in a way that's less rational than I would like to think. And maybe I need to balance that out a little bit. I think without that, we're just going to keep going down this path. And I think what's really interesting as well is that sort of we all know we're doing it, but we're able to think this someone else is going to fix it. So I spent a lot of time thinking about TV and TV metrics and TV measurement, and it always confused me, and for the last like 10-15 years, or intrigued me that there'd be all these big meta studies, from like WARC and big organizations that said, okay, TV's really, really effective at driving profit and it's the most effective by far, all this kind of stuff, and yet TV spend would go down. You're like, well. And all the marketers was like, absolutely agree with that. That's 100% TV. And then they would drop the TV spend. You're like, what? How does that work? I think because it's a large meta study, you're able to sort of say, well, that's totally the case for P&G or Unilever or something else. But I got to make this call in front of my boss, and I've got trust me with TV, and I've got all this sweet little dashboards from performance metrics.
It's easily justifiable, right?
Exactly. And as opposed to, and this is where, things like TV, mediums like TV, I think maybe we're a bit slow to offer stuff they should have done. They are now. Is to show it at like campaign level to make it easier for the marketer to go, hold on, need to balance these two things out. But yeah, so we have absolutely ended up often optimizing for the wrong thing. And I won't say who for obvious reasons as I'll say the story, but we were meeting with a bunch of clients recently, and I walking them through the campaign level outcomes measurement we'd done for Think TV, and they said, we dropped all our TV last year, maybe we shouldn't have done. I was like, yeah, what evidence did you use to drop the TVs? Because like, I just didn't know if it was working.
Yeah.
You're like,
Mhm.
all right. So you
We've
dropped it without knowing it wasn't working.
Yeah, we've
That's the
had
problem.
similar debates with clients previously
Yeah,
around
man,
wanting to
and
cut the TV and
I'm not the one with the budget on it, so I'm not trying to say it's easy, but I think again, if we go back to saying, well, hold on, why am I making this decision?
Mhm.
And is it because it's right or because it's easy to justify, and those
Right.
things are different? Then maybe it gives people pause. But at the same time, we being the industry, needs to provide as much data to help those decisions be as easy as possible.
For sure.
Yeah, because sometimes, we know TV has a longer term payout, right?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, when you've been working towards that for a long time, improving it out, and then drop it, you do see some quite impactful
Yeah.
effects of that.
But, and again, so how do we make it easier for people who every marketer you speak to, I suspect, will agree with you. And every marketer is probably cutting their TV or will have cut their TV budget. So where's that disconnect?
Right.
Yeah.
And how do we help them reconnect that? And again, I'm just bringing up TV.
That's a whole other podcast, my friend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. And it
It
gets
is.
back to the role that data has in
For sure.
how we make decisions. Yeah.
For sure.
I want to switch gears a bit and touch
Sure.
on first-party data for a second, because marketers do spend a lot of time focusing on their first-party data.
Yeah.
How much of it do you think is actually useful when you look at a broad set? And what do you think brands actually need in terms of first-party data, and what do they don't?
Yeah. So a few things. One is this can sometimes be an area where Canada needs to remember we're not the States. So, it's hard not hard, but like, I remember being at the conference, the Live Ramp conference that Rob and I were at last year, and I sat next to a bloke who runs retail media for Albertsons, I think. No, CVS. I think we had like 190 million customer records, which is like preposterous.
Yes. Yeah.
And the largest one that in Canada is PC Optima, which is 16 million, which is fantastic. We work with it, but so the reality is, for most clients, getting a really, really large first-party database is not straightforward, or possibly honestly not possible, but like it's tricky to get that at scale. So one thing is, be cognizant of what you can do and how good that data will be if you're able to do it. So again, it's going back to that fundamentals. Okay, if I was able to collect this, but my best shot is going to be 50,000 people, all right, it's still probably useful, but I have to put that in the right context. I'm not going to make like shattering decisions based on that. I'm going to put it in the right context. So there's a couple of things that we EA can do in those circumstances. One is sometimes what companies will have is they are collecting first-party data, but disparately. So how do we bring that together? So there's a thing called Identity Engine, which lets an organization basically bring all that disparate data sets, first-party data sets together in one place. So at least you're maximizing what you've got, but you've also got a single view of your customer in different contexts. So that's sort of job one. The second thing is, how do I enhance that? So that could be, for example, adding third-party data. So I can understand, all right, if I can't maybe activate against my 50,000 people, if I profile them against Prism or something else, then I've got key groups I know I can go after. Not just, there's a good way that we sometimes describe our business, which is helps understand is and ought. Who do I have? Who ought do I have? So even with a relatively small first-party database, knowing that that's an understanding of your consumer in that context, and then you profile them and you go, okay, these are the kinds of people I want more of. Well, then actually that first-party data is really useful when you've extrapolated it based on that third-party data. And then I guess the last thing is like, don't just do it because you can do it. So be conscious of what you'll end up with and where you'll put that in your decision-making framework, and don't get way too overexcited about it just because I can, because the risk is you'll use it. And it may be a bit broken compass. So work with companies, but work with your agency to figure out the best way of incorporating it. Work with companies at EA to figure out how they can make the best use of it.
I think I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about AI before we
Yes.
wrap up our interview. And I'd love to understand, where you think AI is generally improving, insight generation, decision making, and data collaboration and collection,
Yes.
and where you think maybe we're getting ahead of itself, or we're overhyping.
Yes, both.
Yes.
All of those things. I mean, I think in general, and it's funny. There's so much fear in executive levels around AI, and I don't just mean fear around it, but fear of like appearing to be skeptical about it. So I'm not skeptical about it, and it's way too early to tell where how it's. I don't see any evidence yet of it's improving decision making yet. I think that there's, and funny enough, broken record, but like it goes back to one of those things that you know, one of my favorite film quotes is Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park. When they're going over in the helicopter, and Sir Richard Attenborough is describing, with great pride what his scientists have done, and he says, "Well, you spent all the time thinking about whether you could. You didn't think whether you should." So we can make decisions in milliseconds with the AI, but fast is very rarely better when it comes to a decision-making process. So yeah, you can do it, but like, is it actually, what's that going to lead you to do?
Yeah.
If you optimize against poor data really quickly, that's a bad
I
thing.
think it goes back to a little bit of what you were saying earlier around, a lot of the data sets or a lot of what we look at can be really deep and narrow.
Yeah.
And so we risk deep and narrow and not having the right context.
100%. And we risk basically making decisions around what data can the AI use. That's got nothing to do with the decision you should be making. I remember talking, I won't name names, but talking to a agency group who had this platform they were super, super proud of. And they were showing how it was integrating and decision making, and they're going to stick an AI layer on it, whatever. And I was like, "So where's TV?" And they went, "Oh yeah, we can't." Yeah. And you're like, "Well, hold on." But if that's part of what you should be considering, don't cut it out because it doesn't fit your technical model. So I think when it comes to AI, there's a massive risk that people are going to only put AI on top of data that can be accessible by AI, which is not related to whether that's data that should be used in that decision. There's a company in the States called Futuri, and they do a lot of kind of innovation around like radio. And they did a study, I think last year, where they asked like an LLM to do, I don't know, like 10,000 different campaigns, whatever, and then looked at the results, and it almost always massively underestimated TV, radio at home because the data don't go in there. So, I'm beginning to talk to my broadcast clients and to say, how are we going to get TV data into a shape and form that LLMs can access? Because if not, you'll be cut out. In the same way that platform-based buying has been one of the reasons why, TV and radio and out of home suffer. I mean, they've all caught up to different extents, but like that shift to a platform paradigm led to money going out. And again, people wouldn't admit that, but because it seems a bad reason to not spend money on something because it doesn't come to the platform. But I'm convinced that's one of the reasons why. And this is that on steroids. So if everyone is going to talk about having an AI decision-making engine that doesn't have access to data that should represent 40% plus of a budget, and there's some good things too. So some of the stuff we saw, again, coming out of LiveRamp was this fascinating thing where the decision happens can change. So the decision, sort of the planning decision, if you like, if you think about it as a sort of through line, always would happen prior to the purchase and outcome. I think with agents and AI, what you'll begin to see is decision making happening at the speed of the outcomes, which is great, with the big proviso that make sure you're measuring the outcomes properly about the things that you're trying to measure. But that is a really, really interesting shift. And I get the other area I've got disproportionately excited about is this concept of embeddings, which is a way of basically turning a string of numbers into a specific number. And so there is a bunch of opportunity around data scaling, around decision making in platforms that will happen much more easily when we represent the data differently, essentially.
So interesting.
Never ask me for a short answer, Robin.
To build on that a little bit, 5 years from now, what do you think the smartest marketers will be doing differently from what they're doing today?
Well, hopefully they'll have done some of the things we think they should have done. So in other words, they would have essentially lined up what they're trying to do with the data they have, as opposed to the other way around. So lead with the questions, lead with the framework, don't lead with the data you have. which enables you to put data in its proper context and not to be swayed by the availability of data or the availability of data in certain surfaces like an AI surface. You need to be led by your business is not to put money in their coffers of AI companies. It's to run your business. So
Yeah.
lead with what your business needs and follow with what tools do I have to help me run that business. So I think the smart marketers would have done that. I think they would have taken advantage of ways in which they can bring assets that are uniquely theirs to bear. So if you think about the AI, I think what's clear is that you won't be differentiated by having an AI model accessing the same data as everyone else, because everyone's going to have the same core data. So to really make AI work for a company, they need to leverage assets which only that company can have, which is typically first-party data. So like work with companies like EA to say, how do we get that data into a place where I can leverage that as a company uniquely, and I can do unique collaborations with other ones. So, smart marketers will have gone from a siloed approach to like data out of context to their data put in proper context, and then a network of collaborations where they're able to uniquely have unique combinations of data with other people's first party data through some kind of through a network. That's one of the things we're trying to build. We are building, seeing being built in Canada through EA and other people. But that means, again, the purpose of that isn't just to do something cool, which it is, but it means that business will have unique data, unique assets, sort of married to their objectives and their context that will help them make better decisions, which is ultimately what they need to do.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think we're going to have you back on season 2.
Sure.
Because I think we could continue to talk about this topic for another hour.
I haven't even talked about history yet. I mean, this is...
But I do want to say thank you very much
Pleasure.
for having you here today. It is a really complex landscape and topic, but I do believe that, with the right structure, the right frameworks, the right decisioning matrix, and the right partners, we can make it a little bit less complex. And so thank you and appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
If people want to find you, I assume that they can reach out to you on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
There may be more than one.
If you're looking for a profile picture that's at least 7 years old, then that's me. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thanks again for talking to us today. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
And now we'll do hot takes and headaches. This is where our producer Meg will rapid fire some questions for us to give quick answers on.
Alrighty, first question. Robin, most companies collect far more data than they'll ever use.
That's a good one. I would say yes and no. They do collect far more data than they're going to use in some places, but in other places, they probably need more data.
All right, Kelly?
I think David did a good job talking about this too, about narrowing what you're collecting for an actual purpose. I think that's what's really key, and not just collecting it because you can.
Yeah, for sure. Next question. AI will replace traditional marketing research. Kelly?
I'm going to say no. I think that it can help maybe enhance or narrow ideas or find new things to lean into, but it definitely can't replace the insight and things that you know about your own business.
Robin?
Agree. I think that there are going to be AI agents that can do certain aspects, but will never replace the entire function and the entire system.
Next question. First-party data is overrated. Robin?
Disagree. I think first-party data is really important, and I actually think it's underrated, underutilized, undervalued, but you really need to know what you're doing with it. And, as we talked about with David, have a great strategy in place or a framework in place about what you're trying to answer with it.
Love that answer. Kelly?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah, it's about using it right in the right time, right place, for sure.
Publishers have a competitive advantage over walled gardens. Kelly?
I don't think so. I think because we have access to so much information that everybody has different pieces of information. But when it works well, it's about data being collaborated together to get that deeper understanding. And then again, what we talked about today was about what you do with that and how you create an insight and an action for it is where it becomes really beneficial.
Absolutely. Robin?
Yeah, I think the challenge is that walled gardens right now, I think, have the advantage over publishers only because they're walled gardens and it's easy for brands and marketers to lean into, not necessarily what should be happening. So I hope to see an evolution that we work towards what Kelly just talked about.
Yeah. Okay, final question. Marketing teams are measuring too many things, Robin.
Hmm. I think that they're not always measuring the right things. So, and I don't like to paint everybody with the same brush, but I do believe that most marketers can learn from what David talked about today to understand what they need to look for and how to create hypothesis and understand what they need to work towards.
Kelly?
Yeah, I agree. I think there are too many things being measured. I think that where it becomes effective is pinpointing the different things you're measuring with your business data and outcomes, and then pairing those things together to really understand how what you're doing and what you're measuring is impacting those business results.
That's all the questions I have for today.
Great. I
Okay.
think today's conversation was really interesting. I enjoyed hearing David's perspective on insights and data collaboration and how to, pull all of that together and how to set up a framework for marketers. I think that's really important and gives good context.
Completely agree. I think this is a great episode for every marketer to listen to and learn some things. I definitely know I did.
Yeah. Well, until next time, I'm Robin LeGassicke.
And I'm Kelly Miller.
And that's a wrap.